They had ruled us for less than a century, but in that short span the Galactic Empire had remade the map of our skies. We had thought ourselves clever for surviving the wars of assimilation, trading sovereignty for survival, negotiating trade lanes and colonial charters in exchange for our place in their vast order. Their ships blotted out suns, their law carried no room for negotiation, and their governors spoke in tones that treated compassion as a primitive defect. Still we lived. We adapted. We kept our children safe. Until the decree. They called it population stabilization. A sterile phrase that concealed its nature until the first reports came in. Across human colonies, orbital stations, terraformed worlds, deep space mining outposts, transmissions cut mid-sentence. A planetary census one day, the next, only silence. Imperial drones sealed streets, their cold lenses sweeping over schoolyards. The youngest, deemed non-contributive biomass, were taken in quiet processions. No gunfire, no screams broadcast over public channels, just a sudden absence, as if the galaxy itself had drawn its breath and stolen them away. 77 million. The number came from our own resistance networks, pieced together from intercepted communiques, and the desperate last messages of parents who knew they would not be heard again. 77 million human children, erased in a single coordinated sweep lasting less than 6 hours. The Empire offered no apology, only a statement. Resource optimization measures are necessary for sustained galactic stability. Emotional distress is regrettable but irrelevant. To them, our grief was inefficiency. Our rage was noise. World governance fractured under the weight of it. Some spoke of demanding reparations through the imperial courts. Others argued for retreat, for sealing ourselves within the few territories the Empire still allowed us. But in homes, in refugee camps, in the quiet places where the official channels could not see, the talk was different. It was not of diplomacy. It was of debt. Blood debt. The loss did not unite humanity instantly, pain rarely does. But it sharpened something in us. A father on Mars sold his shipping fleet to fund black market weapons research. A grandmother on Proxima smuggled encryption keys to old military networks. Entire mining crews on the Kuiper colonies simply disappeared from the Imperial work logs, taking with them ships, tools, and decades of grudges. Those first days after the atrocity had no speeches worth remembering, no declarations that would survive the history books. There was only the quiet burn of a species that had been pushed past endurance. We were not the strongest race under Imperial rule, nor the most advanced. We could not match their fleets ship for ship. But we had memory. We had the capacity to imagine horrors worse than what had been done to us, and the will to make those horrors real for the ones who had brought them. It began with whispers inside certain human intelligence circles. Fighting the Empire openly would mean annihilation. Striking at their supply chains and ships would take years we might not have. But their soldiers were not machines. They slept. They dreamed. They feared, even if they pretended otherwise. And fear, properly cultivated, could rot a structure faster than fire. The first question was simple: what does the Empire not understand about us? The answer was immediate: our myths. They had dissected our science, broken our codes, learned our languages. But they had never understood why we told stories of things that could not be seen, things that could not be killed by conventional means. They could not comprehend why children feared shadows under the bed or why an old folktale could make grown men glance over their shoulders in the dark. We began to remember the names we had spoken in childhood with dread. The things that came for you when you were helpless. The things that punished those who harmed the innocent. And somewhere in that exchange of ideas, the first operatives were chosen. Not soldiers in the traditional sense, but people who could vanish into hostile territory, leave no trace but a message, and make that message spread like a sickness. We had no plan yet for fleets or armies. But we had something older than either, the promise that for the 77 million taken, someone would come. Not as diplomats. Not as liberators. But as nightmares given flesh. Direct confrontation was suicide. Everyone in the intelligence division knew it. The Empire's fleets could blot out our skies before we had a chance to scramble a single defense wing. But empires have soft places, and soft places can be struck. Ours would not be a campaign of ships and armies. It would be a campaign of whispers, of shadows, of fear planted so deep that steel and plasma could not cut it out. The first framework came from a strategist with a background in cultural anthropology. She said the words that changed the course of our response. If we can't outgun them, we'll make them afraid to face us. The Empire's doctrine treated fear as a flaw of the undeveloped. They believed they had outgrown it. That arrogance was the breach we needed. From there, the operation took shape. It was not enough to act unseen. We needed to become something more than human in their eyes. Every civilization tells stories to warn their young, and ours held some of the most enduring. Two names rose to the surface, one from the western cradle, one from the eastern. The Boogeyman, who takes those who deserve to vanish, and Baba Yaga, the relentless, cunning witch who cannot be bargained with and never forgets a slight. They would become the symbols of our retribution. Not as mere code names, but as living myths. The planning phase was precise. Operatives were selected not only for skill but for adaptability, patience, and an ability to vanish without a trace. Psychological profiles favored those who could think like predators rather than soldiers. They would work alone or in pairs, never operating in the same sector twice in rapid succession. To the Empire, it would appear that the threat was everywhere and nowhere. The first deployments were surgical. An isolated outpost on the fringe of Imperial-controlled space lost its entire command team in a single night. No alarms tripped, no security footage survived. Only their bodies remained, positioned in unnatural ways, visors cracked, weapons untouched. A message was left on the wall in both standard Imperial and human script. The Boogeyman comes for those who harm children. There was no demand, no threat of future attacks, only a statement of inevitability. Weeks later, a supply ship failed to report in. It was found adrift, its crew missing. In the captain's quarters sat a single crude carving of a hunched, long-limbed figure with hollow eyes. The image matched no known alien species. To humans, it needed no explanation. To the Empire, it was a puzzle they could not solve, which made it worse. With each strike, the myth grew. Human networks seeded fragments of these stories into channels the Empire could not fully police. Intercepted transmissions carried half-heard rumors, cryptic warnings, and sightings that were never confirmed. The names began to circulate among lower-ranking Imperial soldiers, spoken in the same tones humans once used for curses. Commanders attempted to suppress the rumors, but suppression only made them spread. When an officer was found dead in his locked quarters on a secured capital ship, the official report claimed an accident. But among the crew, whispers said the Boogeyman had walked through walls. Imperial analysts tried to treat the incidents as coordinated guerrilla strikes. What they failed to understand was that each was a story first, an operation second. The tactical damage was minimal compared to the corrosive effect on morale. Every unexplained noise in the dark became a potential threat. Every flicker in a security feed could be the moment before a nightmare arrived. The operation did not seek victory through numbers. It sought infection. The fear was meant to travel faster than any ship, to reach soldiers who had never even set foot on human worlds. In the mess halls and barracks of distant garrisons, they began to speak of us not as a defeated people, but as a cursed one. A species that birthed monsters to defend its own. The Empire had always underestimated humanity's capacity to create and believe in the unreal. Now, that capacity was turned outward. Our myths had teeth, and they were already deep in the enemy's mind. They spoke her name in hushed tones even among our own. To the enemy, she was only a rumor at first, an embellishment to make the Boogeyman's shadow stretch further. But Baba Yaga was no fiction. She was a single operative, older than most in the field, her face forgettable in the way that made her impossible to track. Before the atrocity, she had been a teacher on a small lunar colony. After it, she became the sharpest blade in the covert arsenal. Her methods differed from the precision kills attributed to the Boogeyman. Where he struck like an instant disappearance, she worked like a slow sickness. She would infiltrate an Imperial position under some harmless guise: maintenance worker, food vendor, refugee seeking documentation. She studied routines, weaknesses, and personal ties with the patience of a spider waiting in its web. Then, without any visible escalation, the target's command structure would collapse. Officers vanished. Supplies rotted in locked storerooms. Communications failed without technical explanation. By the time anyone realized there was an active threat, she was already gone. Her calling card was unnerving in its simplicity: hand-carved dolls left behind after each strike. They were never identical. Some resembled human children, others distorted shapes with long limbs and empty eyes. The number of dolls always matched the number of lives taken. To the Imperial mind, it was an irrational gesture, wasteful, pointless. But the soldiers who found them began to dread the sight more than any weapon. Her most decisive act came against the Empire's fleet command in the Delta Verge. The flagship was under the highest security protocols in active service, with layered clearance checks, biometric locks, and armed guards at every entry. She bypassed them all without leaving a trace of forced entry. Hours later, the Admiral and his senior staff were discovered seated in their conference chamber, eyes open but lifeless, expressions fixed in an uncanny calm. In the center of the table was a single doll, carved from the ship's own interior paneling, with the words, "For the children," burned into its base. No one could explain how it had been made or placed there. From that day, her legends spread beyond human-controlled channels. The Empire tried to control the narrative, labeling her a terrorist. But among oppressed species in the outer sectors, the story grew in translation. To some she was a witch who hunted tyrants, to others, a spirit of vengeance that could walk through walls and taste lies on the air. Each telling made her less human and more inevitable. The psychological toll on Imperial forces escalated quickly. Units reported refusing orders to station in sectors where she had been sighted. Guards doubled shifts, only to find themselves more exhausted and more prone to mistakes. Some claimed they had seen her in dreams, standing silent at the foot of their bunks, watching without blinking. These dreams were dismissed by Imperial command as paranoia, yet the accounts were consistent across systems, even among those with no contact. Her reputation also served a secondary purpose. It encouraged resistance in places humanity could not reach. Small insurgencies on non-human worlds began to claim that Baba Yaga had aided them, whether or not it was true. The Empire found itself fighting an invisible army that existed partly in reality, and partly in imagination. That distinction ceased to matter. She never spoke publicly, never recorded a message. Her silence allowed every enemy soldier to imagine their own version of her, and imagination was always crueler than fact. The more the Empire tried to catch her, the more the myth outpaced the truth. And in that widening gap, fear became certainty. Somewhere out there, in the corridors of their ships and the shadows of their bases, Baba Yaga was waiting. The Empire's strength had always been in its order. Every fleet, every outpost, every regiment functioned within an exact hierarchy, predictable as a machine. That order began to unravel from within long before the first official retreat. It started in the lower ranks, with soldiers quietly trading posts to avoid assignments near human sectors. Then officers began requesting transfers, citing unreliable morale, a phrase that masked the truth. Fear had taken root, and it was spreading faster than command could contain it. Incidents multiplied. Entire garrisons reported phantom intrusions, doors found open that had been locked, systems cycling at random, missing personnel whose bodies were never recovered. Command assumed it was sabotage by infiltrators, but investigations led nowhere. When no culprits were found, suspicion turned inward. Accusations between comrades became common, and the trust that kept Imperial units functional eroded. The reaction from above was swift and brutal. Discipline was enforced through public executions, long hours, and constant readiness drills. This only deepened the problem. Exhaustion magnified paranoia. Shadows lengthened in their minds until they saw enemies in every flicker of light, every unexplained sound. Officers began overreacting to the smallest irregularities, detonating stores or purging data at the first hint of intrusion, often destroying more resources than the enemy could have hoped to. False reports became as damaging as real attacks. The Boogeyman was sighted on stations he had never touched, and Baba Yaga's carved dolls were found in places she could not possibly have reached, sometimes planted by frightened soldiers themselves in a desperate bid to be transferred. Fleet movements slowed, missions were abandoned mid-flight, and ships returned to dock without orders. While the Empire wasted energy fighting shadows, humanity moved on another front. Diplomatic envoys, backed by carefully chosen defectors, approached neutral and oppressed worlds with offers of alliance. Many of these species had suffered under imperial rule but lacked the will to resist. The myths had given them something tangible, proof that the Empire was not untouchable. They began providing intelligence, safe harbors, and supply chains in exchange for assurances that the same protection visited on humans might be extended to them. Defections from within the Empire increased. Some were low-ranking officers seeking safety. Others were high-value commanders who could no longer ignore the decay of their forces. One admiral surrendered his entire battle group after his family experienced recurring nightmares of a silent figure standing outside their quarters, an image he could not explain and would not risk dismissing as coincidence. Each defection was exploited with precision. Fleet routes, security codes, and internal protocols were leaked to human operatives. Even when not immediately actionable, the leaks forced the Empire to overhaul entire systems, wasting resources and time. Every change in procedure meant retraining crews already stretched thin and already doubting their survival. By the time Imperial leadership recognized that they were losing control, it was too late. Fear had become part of the structure. It was in their language, in the way orders were worded to avoid certain terms, in the way soldiers refused to speak of certain sectors at all. In official communiques, they still called humanity a manageable insurgent population. In the barracks, they called us cursed. The Boogeyman and Baba Yaga no longer needed to act for their presence to be felt. The Empire had begun dismantling its own operations, retreating from contested zones not because of military defeat, but because their troops could no longer be convinced to hold them. In every sense that mattered, the war had shifted from our survival to their surrender, and it was their own fear, not our fleets, that drove them back. The Empire's withdrawal came without ceremony. No formal treaty, no acknowledgement of defeat, only a series of reassignments and fleet redeployments that left human worlds unoccupied. Their public channels called it strategic consolidation, but everyone knew the truth. They had weighed the cost of holding our territory against the dread that now accompanied every mention of humanity, and the dread had won. In the absence of open conflict, life began to stitch itself back together. Colonies once patrolled by Imperial drones reopened their streets. Supply ships no longer traveled under heavy guard. Families returned from hidden bunkers, and laughter, tentative at first, found its way back into public spaces. The scars were deep, and the number 77 million was etched into every conversation, but we were no longer waiting for the next blow to fall. The Boogeyman and Baba Yaga disappeared as suddenly as they had emerged. There were no farewell transmissions, no declarations of mission complete. One day, the reports of strikes ceased. Some believed they had been killed. Others whispered that they had simply gone to ground, waiting for the next threat. In truth, their absence was part of the plan. Myths are strongest when they cannot be pinned to a schedule. Human command made no attempt to reveal their identities. Files were sealed, operations classified beyond the highest clearance. Even those who had coordinated their missions knew only fragments of the whole picture. The names were allowed to drift back into the realm of stories, where they could live without the burden of proving themselves. The enemy had learned to fear them. That fear required no further proof. In the years that followed, those stories began to take on new shapes. In some tellings, the Boogeyman was a spirit conjured by the grief of millions. In others, Baba Yaga was an ancient protector who walked among the stars. The details shifted, but the core remained. When humanity's children were taken, retribution came from the shadows, and it did not stop until the threat was gone. Our fleets remained small compared to the giants of the galaxy, but they sailed under banners that carried new weight. Diplomats found doors open where once they had been slammed shut. Formerly neutral worlds greeted human envoys with a mix of caution and respect, some openly admitting that they had refused imperial demands in the hope that our monsters might one day come for them too. For those of us who had lived through the years between the massacre and the withdrawal, the quiet was its own challenge. Vengeance had given purpose. Peace required something else entirely. We turned our attention to rebuilding schools, expanding settlements, and reconnecting the fractured lines between our scattered colonies. Yet the shadow of what had been done never left. Memorials rose on every world, not just to remember the lost, but to remind us of what we had become capable of when pushed beyond the brink. On one rebuilt colony, a teacher kept a carved wooden doll on her desk. Its features were simple, but its eyes seemed older than the material they were cut from. She never explained where it came from. When asked, she would only say it was a story from before the war, a story meant to keep children safe. The students accepted it without question, the way the next generation always does. We had not been the strongest. We had not been the most advanced. But when the galaxy took from us what could never be replaced, we answered in a language older than strategy or technology. We answered with the monsters we had whispered about in the dark since we first learned to fear, and we made that fear theirs. The Empire would rebuild its fleets, conquer new worlds, and call itself eternal. But in the places its soldiers gathered, where stories passed unchallenged, the lesson would remain: humanity's nightmares do not sleep, and they do not forgive.